This book tells the story of the first of three battles of 1066. The Fulford battle is remarkable for three reasons. First, the physical evidence allows the action to be described in detail. Second, it reveals that the leaders at Fulford were tactically very savvy. And finally, the subsequent battles cannot be understood without reference to what happened at Fulford. The battle action at Fulford, which is arguably the biggest of 1066, is not a slugging match between two shield walls, but one of clever tactics and manoeuvre. The consensus among the sources says that the battle took place on Wednesday the 20th September 1066. This is according to the Julian calendar, which changed in 1582 to the Gregorian version, so in 1066 there is a 7-day gap between the two calendars, which is important for some of the calculations such as the tide. The early literature provides two 12th century references naming the place of the battle as Fulford, or more precisely, Fulford or Fulforda. This is 3 kilometres from the centre of York, which is named as the place of the battle 3 times in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The background is that Earl Morcar had replaced Earl Tostig late in 1065, who was exiled after this coup. But Earl Tostig was the brother of King Harold, who was now, at the start of 1066, the King of England. Tostig, of course, wanted his land back, as well as his title, perhaps even hoping to overthrow his brother. So he persuaded the King Harold of Norway, who was later known as Harald Hardrada, to provide an army to invade England. To protect the north, King Harold told Edwin, Earl of Mercia, and Morcar, the new Earl of Northumbria, to guard the north against this expected Viking invasion, and he had married their sister. Just a short detour before describing the battle to outline the work that permits this battle to be described in such detail. There are over 30 written sources describing the battle. Most focus on the people and politics, but some describe the battle and the actions, and these could be archaeologically tested. A formal method was employed in this search for the battle, and once a probable location was identified, a decade of excavation confirmed that location, but also produced many exciting finds, allowing the action to be traced on the ground. Finally, it is the timetable of the tide which provides us with an accurate timing for this particular battle action. King Harold of Norway was getting old and had actually handed over the throne of his son, the product of a second marriage. He was persuaded to invade, even though his wife, his daughter, and another son were taken along with him. All of this would make life a lot simpler for his elder son, the new king. A careful examination of Tostig's travels at this time suggests that he met Duke William, who recognised the advantages of coordinating the two invasions, north and south. After this, Tostig went raiding along the English coast before heading north to Scotland to await the Norwegian fleet. These raids also allowed Tostig to refine the plan for the northern invasion with some close reconnaissance. It was a very clever plan that he devised, and it would pose a lot of problems for Edwin and Morcar. When the invasion happened, after capturing Scarborough, some invaders moved south, but King Harold sailed ahead so that he could arrive at Fulford and threaten York. The saga tells us that the Norse invaders did not need to row their longships, even though they were travelling upstream, with the exceptional tidal bore that allowed them to reach Fulford in the late afternoon. There's only room for about 60 ships at Fulford, and Tostig knew this because Fulford had been his home for 13 years. This arrival posed the defenders with a problem, because the next day the invaders could continue to ride the next tide straight into York, or they could cross the river when the tide was very low to capture York, or they could attack along the east bank. The defenders had to cover each of these attack options. This meant that the Mercians marched that night from Tadcaster to guard the west bank, while the Northumbrians guarded the city and blocked the ford. Until midday, the armies were separated by a tidal flood, which had arrived shortly before first light on the day of the battle. This flood gave Tostig time to bring the rest of the army from Rickel, 15 kilometres away. That's about 3 hours of hard marching away from Fulford. It was therefore only mid-morning before the defenders really realised that the main army was only just arriving, and Harold's landing the night before had been a distraction. This confusion was actually probably part of the plan of Tostig to wrong-foot the defenders. He was certainly taking full advantage of his local knowledge. Earl Morcar, however, had just enough time on this timetable to gather all his army and get them to the ford. His brother, meanwhile, had noted that his army, while stranded on the opposite bank, had spotted that the invaders would be able to get behind the Northumbrian army when the tide dropped. So he led some of his men and deployed them to the west bank, to the east bank, to block this route. All this time the tide appeared to stand still. It is one of the oddities of the river that the ebb tide lasts over 8 hours. Once enough of the army had been assembled, Tostig deployed some troops along what is called the ditch in the literature. But this was a trap. We are told that Tostig's army, by the Norse sources, looked weak. They wanted to entice Morcar to bring his army across the stream, which was known as Germany Beck, because the north bank where they were positioned was in fact a very strong defensive position. Morcar's army, however, used the wide Roman-built stone ford to splash across the beck, moving in dead ground until they smashed into Tostig's right flank. All reports say that Morcar's army advanced bravely, driving Tostig's weak army back. But all this time more troops were arriving from Rickel, and King Harold was waiting for just the right moment to launch some counterattacks. It served the veteran warrior Harold to let Tostig be driven back in this way before coming to his rescue. Not only will it make clear to Tostig who actually won the battle, but Harold actually still needed some time for the tide to fall to launch his counterattacks. So it was probably not until about 4 in the afternoon that conditions were just right for this. Before then, we have a real slugging match which goes on for about 2. When the time was right, the experienced warrior, King Harold, launched 2 counterattacks. One went alongside the river to dislodge the small Mercian force that had relocated there from the west bank to try and stop the invaders crossing and getting behind the Northumbrian army. The second attack was towards what is called the Pool, where he hoped to cut off any chance of retreat for Morcar's army. But Earl Morcar had reacted quickly. We have a good description from one of the Mercians who was left stranded on the west bank. Most of Morcar's army managed to withdraw from the battle, retreating along the peat ditch. However, this was only possible because his Hearth troops blocked the invaders' advance. And Harold's men did not have it all their own way, as we found lots of evidence that they were showered with arrows from the Mercians left stranded on the west bank. But we also found fragments of sword that had been driven between the stones at the base of the beck where the housecarls made their last stand. The surviving account talks of the tide rushing back as the light was fading. Anyone stuck in the ditch would be drowned. It is estimated the tidal water was about 3 meters deep here. So this brought the fighting at the ford to an end, but the battle continued elsewhere. Beside the river, Earl Edwin and a small contingent of the Mercians would try to block the path, which was only 20 metres wide, but they had water on both sides. They could not, however, prevent the momentum of a charging Norse invading army crossing the beck at this point. After a long retreat, Edwin surrendered when it was clear his men were surrounded and that the prospect of drowning when the tide returned was very real. We have a good report of this meeting, where Tostig complained that Harold had not immediately executed Edwin. While all this was happening, Earl Morcar had rallied his surviving troops at a place which is described as somewhere that they could not be attacked, and this place still has water and very steep banks on three sides and would have provided an excellent refuge. However, the arrival of the flood tide there forced them to retreat, but at least the tidal bore had stopped the enemy chasing them. One important footnote: the valiant housecarls kept Earl Morcar's banner with them. The invaders saw the banner among the dead at the ford. This led the Norse sources to report that Morcar had been killed, which we know is wrong. Work continues on the site since we now know where to focus attention. The view that there will be no physical finds from battlefields of this era has been shown to be wrong. Tracing the battlefield on the ground tells us much about the characters of the leaders, but sheds light on those who fought in the shield walls. Understanding the way the battle unfolded provides an insight into the real historical narrative of 1066 and this turning point in English history. The new book goes into much more detail. It has three different sections. The main section described here is the battle itself, but another presents the people and the politics as its focus, and the third explains the impact that the battle had. There is actually a fourth video which goes in a little bit more detail to the archaeology. The roles of King Harold's brother Earl Tostig and Duke William, plus their wives Judith and Matilda, are detailed, along with the real King Macbeth and Lady Godiva, who all play a significant part in this 1066 narrative. The omission of this encounter from our national story has allowed a lot of mythologizing about 1066. The contemporary records and now the abundant evidence explains the key actions and the timings at Fulford. With 5 fresh armies involved, this is arguably the biggest of the battles of 1066. Including the opening battle at Fulford provides an interpretation of 1066 which is significantly different from the normal narrative that ended the Anglo-Saxon rule. I hope you enjoyed this video and will look for the other videos.